Hi, I'm Nikunj, and welcome to Postcards, your unseen passport to all things people, policy, and politics. At Postcards, we aim to talk about some of the conversations that we don't usually have, and by bringing diverse set of speakers, we hope to give you certain nuances about the different topics that we'll be discussing on the day.
Even a world that has stuff toys being real things and monsters existing under your bed
Yeah.
is a world that can accommodate queerness very easily. You shouldn't have these sex ed classes, etc., which introduce you to queerness. Queerness is more foundational than that. I've gone and met Ajith Pawar when he was Deputy Chief Minister. He constantly remains Deputy Chief Minister, so the man is quite a genius, because regardless of who is in power, he is it.
Hi, welcome to Postcards. Today I'm very excited to talk about the episode Queerness in 2024 with my incredible guest Anish Gawande. Anish is the founder of Pinklist India. His achievements know no length and breadth. He is also a Rhodes Scholar, but he's also my dear friend, and we were classmates
Correct.
at Oxford.
Yes.
Funnily, this time last year, I was doing Instagram Live by the same name, Postcards, with Bianca on the justice system, Winnie on energy, and Victor on the refugee crisis around Ukraine. So it's been like a very interesting kind of like a full journey. Now having you on this episode 2 years later at the start of this podcast and having you as a first guest, super excited, and thank you so much for doing this.
No, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be the first guest and to be chatting about things as we have a massive political churn happening in Delhi. So, what better way to talk about queerness in 2024 than after an election?
Exactly, just one day after the
swearing-in ceremony. You know, it's good time to talk.
Right. Did you go for the swearing-in ceremony?
हमें तो मोदी जी ने नहीं बुलाया. Please, if you're watching, I would love to be there next time. I have no principles, values, or morals. I'll come for the free food at Rashtrapati Bhavan. Seemed like they all had a nice time.
Yeah, I was seeing like a bunch of Instagram, photos
nice
and
food
posts
and all, but apparently someone was like, you couldn't really see the ceremony very well. So I was like, but who's going there to see the ceremony? Like, I'm going there to chill, na? Like
to chill, to network and and everything else.
Network you can't do that. 2,000 log the.
You're expert in networking. I think that is one of the good things that you have, Anish, actually.
But then you have to network in the smaller room. 2,000 लोगों में why waste your time on somebody who's been invited? ऐसे
That's true.
किसी के MP का +1 आ गया, फिर क्या उसका?
That's true.
Delhi has enough other spaces for networking. India International Center was created only for that.
Yeah, that's true. That has a very long history as well, right? Yeah, 100%. But yeah, so if someone is watching, please invite Anish to the next wedding, which is like 5 years from now.
Well, hopefully not. So maybe earlier.
Maybe earlier.
We never know.
We never know. Yeah.
Let this government also understand the struggles of running a coalition.
Yeah.
Having the threat of somebody pull out all the time. So, it's good.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to how things evolve. Actually, I'm pretty excited to see.
I think it'll be good to watch Indian politics return to some semblance of normal.
Yeah.
Where I think somebody put it brilliantly. I think Yodha Yadav only, who I think has done a fairly good job this election, but he put it nicely when he said Indian politics is back to what it was like. No reason to celebrate massively. I don't think it's a huge change. I don't think the world is going to look very different.
Yeah.
But it's back to how it was 10 years ago.
Yeah. So, and everyone can have their own opinions about like good.
Yeah. But it's
like stronger.
It's that also I won't say. I think it's gone back. The democratic backsliding has been stopped.
Exactly.
So you're not going to see a level of decision making that happens unilaterally. You're going to just see the goods and the bads of coalition politics, the sort of like dramabazi. You're going to see like compromise being made. You're going to see somebody trying to extract their pound of flesh at the right moment. But you'll be seeing a lot of sensibleness in decision making.
Right, and a lot of give and take, and like how the decision making is supposed to be.
Correct, which is great.
Yeah. I'm also curious about your journey, though, right, as an individual, and I wanna start talking about a little bit about your queer journey, right, and like what kind of experience have shaped your understanding of queerness, right? I think on the Lisa Mangaldas podcast, you talked a little bit about, for example, struggles of dating as a queer, but at this in a largely cis-normative, heteronormative society, right? So how's it been like living in a cis-normative, heteronormative society, right? That way, and growing up, how it was like for you?
I think I always knew I was queer quite early on, right? I knew I was gay. I was sort of on the internet very early on and sort of realized that I'm not straight. But even then, I wanted to work in politics. I wanted to be an IAS officer, an IFS officer, sort of do something at the UN. And for me, for a very long time, it was impossible to reconcile other aspects of my identity with my queerness, which I think is even today the biggest struggle in a sort of cis heteronormative setup, right? Where your queerness can be an impediment to you doing other things. It's not the queerness in and of itself that is posing hurdles to your life, but it is, except for the dating bit where it is posing a very real hurdle to your life. But otherwise, you're sort of worried about the ramifications of that queerness on anything else you decide to pursue. So for me, what was a very foundational experience growing up was voluntarily being in the closet, which I think was a strange space to be in, because I knew there was nothing wrong with being gay. I didn't have, after a point, any level of stigma around it. I was in New York City at Columbia for my undergrad for an entire year before I came out. And that too, I only came out when I was in Paris, where I knew nobody and nobody knew me, because I just felt that it was a stupid decision to come out.
Really?
It was just, to me at that point, and in hindsight, you never know, hindsight is 2020. So even now, there are points at which, given the work that I do, I wonder what it would have been like to do all of this work as a straight person, right? Particularly the more sort of mainstream political work. I've been fortunate enough to be able to navigate that fairly effectively, but I wouldn't say the queerness is not a concern. So I think what really defined my queerness early on was this understanding that believing in queer equality as a principle is much harder or is much easier than embracing queer equality in practice, even as a queer person. To say that I will lead my full life, or I will, the fancy thing everyone says, bring your whole self to work. Like, it's nice to say, I agree with it in principle, everyone should bring their whole self to work, but when you are asked to bring your whole self to work, it's a tricky question. And this is something that I grapple with and have spoken to friends and sort of people I mentor as well, that you have to take these decisions in a very cold-hearted, calculating manner.
Right.
And so I think that was the defining force of my queerness. And I think the other defining force for my queerness was an understanding that it allowed me to gain an insight into the sort of forms of marginalization that others face. Right? I think we talk a lot of intersectionality, and I think it's obviously important when you're queer to be intersectional and to have struggles come together. But I think when you put it in that sort of academic framework, you lose the essence, which is that जब एक फटका गिरा ना आपको एक बार, तो आपको दूसरों के फटके भी समझ आते हैं. So you just understand a lot better. When you've gone through an experience that really sort of affects you, then you understand what it means to also sort of inflict that on somebody else, because I come with caste privilege and caste privilege and religious privilege and class privilege in a country like India. And so it has allowed me to also be more empathetic and recognize the ways in which I cause harm as well, right? And to look at solidarity through that lens as a sort of common struggle that's derived from an understanding of how that struggle affects you. And that's been particularly defining at moments where, queerness can afford to divorce itself from other struggles and get its own place in society far more easily. So I think those two things of knowing theoretically that there is no problem with being queer, but knowing practically that there have to be ways in which you dress, there have to be ways in which you present yourself, there have to be ways in which you speak, that then impact other aspects of your life, given that you live in a cis-heteronormative society. And the second, that you have a way in which that sort of theoretical aspect of solidarity needs to be brought into lived practice by an understanding that it's you who have understood the repercussions of that harm.
Yeah.
And it is also you who can cause that harm for others. Sorry, very long-winded answer.
No, I think, and it's a double-edged sword almost in a way, right? Because I think at many of the times, and I was reading this interesting article yesterday by, if I remember correctly, Sujoy Das, and she was talking about how Dalit women are often like limited to just their Dalit identity, and mostly it's like a very casteist gaze where every Dalit person, for example, is just reduced to their oppression and discrimination, right? And yeah, that's true. Those are the lived experiences, but there is so much else. There's a sense of community. They're fighting against it. But I think at the end of the day, that's not the only lens to look someone else from. And I think sometimes, I think that is also
100%.
equally important as well.
100%.
You know, I was a teacher, right? Like at least for a couple of years, I taught in a all-girls classroom in Teacher India Fellowship. And I think one of the things I struggled with was explaining a concept to students, right? And the younger they are, the more difficult it is. So how would you explain queerness to a 7-year-old?
You know, I've always believed that you shouldn't have these sex ed classes, etc., which introduce you to queerness. Queerness is more foundational than that, right? So I've been a big advocate of changing maths textbooks. So if anyone here watching is an educationist, if you have access to maths textbook editing, please. When you're growing up, you're sort of taught that John bought 5 apples for his wife. How many his wife had 6 apples at home. Now how many apples do John and his wife have? Just change husband. John bought 5 apples for his husband. You know, like it's at that sort of almost subconscious level that you need to explain queerness. This is not a sort of aberration, but it is a possibility.
Yeah.
And it's not that you change everything to John and his husband.
Yeah.
1 or 2. You can have John and his wife also, you can have John and his husband also, you can have John and his like partner also, you can have like John being a trans man, you can have like all sorts of possibilities. But I believe in introducing queerness through play, right? I think that you are introduced to a wide assortment of characters as a child.
Yeah.
And your sort of imaginative possibilities are highest when you're a child. And to fit queerness within those imaginative possibilities is not hard. In fact, we lose those imaginative possibilities as we grow older. That you can believe in a world that has stuffed toys being real things and monsters existing under your bed is a world that can accommodate queerness very easily. You know, as you grow older is when you get rigidified into and solidified into thinking that only certain things are possible and only certain sort of structures need to be maintained and kept as they are.
Yeah.
And to me, queerness is a broadening of the imagination, and so to explain it to children is far easier than to explain it to adults. So I'm going to be like, oh, but then what will happen if man and man marry, or like the concerns that people who are grown-ass adults have around queerness seem so silly compared to the willingness with which queerness can be accepted by kids who just see it as very much like sure. And so I think to explain to kids is to introduce that element of play and to work through that imagination. And I think kids are far better than we give them credit.
100%.
I think they'll be cooler than most politicians I deal with in understanding queerness.
Yeah. I mean, there's this interesting, I think I think it was a podcast, Ministry of Imagination kind of a podcast.
Okay.
And they have compiled it in a beautiful like a PDF which has all these like ideas around how to do, like big ideas for the future. And one of the ones was, let's have kids, like let's have 7 to 14-year-old kids as part of our, main cabinets or something like that, because they have brimming with ideas.
Yeah.
And there's no like feasibility check.
Correct.
And some of them can be turn out to be like so brilliant and great, you will never know, right? And I think that's what you're talking about. Like,
absolutely. I think good. I like this idea of no feasibility check. I think kids don't have feasibility check, which is great. Like, let someone run with an idea.
Yeah.
And I think that's inspiring, because I think once you grow older, feasibility checks become the most important aspect of anything you do, where you're like, acha, like, am I studying this degree because I want to, or because it's going to get me a job? And like, what is the viability of doing something that I like versus doing something that I need to? What is the sort of like long-term like benefit of X versus the short-term pleasure of Y, And you sort of need to throw that out of the like sorting hat for a bit and be like, I'm going to choose something because I want to, not because I have thought about like 600 ramifications. So bas.
No, makes sense. I think a little earlier you were also talking about, right, your queer identity and how, for example, you were thinking about at some stage IFS, IPS, and maybe that wasn't the only reason, but like there are way, like, there is a particular path that you took over a period of time in your life. There is a certain way you were mentioning about like just dressing up on little things. I'm just curious. I think there's a sense of exclusion at times here as well, right? And so when have you mostly felt excluded because of your queer identity?
I thought I would join the IS or the IPS. I realized that was not a possibility, primarily because I don't think that I would be comfortable morally with following orders that I did not agree with, right? And I think as you're seeing increasing politicization of the bureaucracy, those are not choices that are in your hand. And again, I want to be good at any profession I get into. Not like I don't want to be like some like protesting the bureaucrat who's going to get transferred to some middle of nowhere place and be a footnote in a newspaper. So if you want to do your job well, you can't do it if there is a political structure that, at least for the foreseeable future, doesn't look like it's going to engage in policy decisions you don't agree with. I think I'd sort of left any hope of coming back to India or doing anything in this space. I studied comparative literature. I did Francophone West Africa and South Asia and Senegalese linguistic politics in the 1960s.
Wow.
I was like, let me just go become a professor, like chill, lead my life, like do like West African, like Pan-Africanism and negritude, and chill for the rest of time in the US. And then a couple of weeks before I graduated in 2018, I got a phone call from Milind Deora, who was then in the Congress party and was going to run for office again in 2019, who asked me, will you come and run my campaign? And I said, I'm very out and I'm in New York City. And he's like, so? I think that was a turning point, right? I think that was when you know that the possibilities of choosing something you love are so limited, when somebody throws you an opportunity and is like, nope, I don't care about the fact that you're gay, I don't care about the fact that like you didn't think this is a possibility, like come, do it. I'm giving you the chance. Right? I think the exclusion happens directly very often, of course. But in my case, I think it was the fear of that exclusion that prevented me from ever entering in the first place. Right? That you don't step into a place where you expect to not have a reward. There's that feasibility check. Now, politics, the feasibility check in I was like, what is the point of getting into politics? It won't ever possibly happen. So I didn't give myself the chance to be excluded. Now, whatever forces there may be in the world made it happen in such a way that bloody senior politician called me up and said, run my campaign, and then things worked out, and he still remains a very dear friend despite his switch over. And has been a guiding force in politics since, and I've gone on to run almost 3 of his campaigns.
Right. Okay.
And sort of worked in politics in a much more direct manner than I'd ever thought possible. And so, you know, these moments of exclusion are not direct. They're sort of, and they are for a lot of people. For me, I think they're not direct. And when they are direct, they can be countered a little more effectively. You know, if somebody is denying your house, you can like find a way to counter it. You can seek support. You can create solidarity around that moment. But the more difficult exclusion is the one that you bring upon yourself, right? You exclude yourself from opportunities because you don't think they're viable. And I think that, now, how can I complain to you? मैं तुम्हें बोलूँगा कि, oh, like I'm so sad I can't enter politics. You'd be like, why don't you try? You know? And that's the tricky bit, where you have to make that decision, because there'll be a lot of people who wish you well, who will encourage you to break boundaries, to sort of take risks, but they don't have to take those risks now. So at the end of the day, you have to make that choice. That are you willing to take that risk? Are you willing to sort of put yourself out there and have the incredibly high possibility of getting hurt in the process? And so that self-censorship, or like sort of exclusion by yourself that happens, I think, is the hardest to deal with, because you're constantly like,
Yeah. And I mean, there's enough data which also talks about, in terms of recruitment, in terms of, you know, in other spaces where we, like, you know, women or folks from marginalized communities like constantly you know, self-reject themselves and are less likely to apply, versus like a cis-het man who's the most confident individual on the planet.
But you know, the problem is now that a lot of this data has been used to encourage women to apply, to encourage Dalit people to apply. And to me, that's flawed, because you're encouraging Dalit people to apply so they can get rejected now.
Yeah.
So very nice. मतलब तुम बोलो बेटा सपने देखो. कैसे? मतलब तुम reject हो जाओगे. क्योंकि you're not the person being like बेटा apply करो, you're not coming and saying, oh sorry तुम्हें job नहीं मिला, मैं दे दूंगा ना. You're not coming and giving that person a job. You're telling them go get rejected. Why? Then why is that self-censorship not useful? It's a survival tactic. You can't discount it or condemn it or say oh, people are not applying. So the best thing that people say, like we couldn't find anyone for this job. Like किसी ने apply नहीं किया. No woman applied, so we can't give them the job.
Yeah.
You have to change those structures that allow for that exclusion to take place in such a blatant manner, because without that you can't get more people to sort of participate. And so that self-exclusion is necessary in my opinion. And it's I hate this sort of like I hate self-help books. I hate motivational speakers. And I hate anybody who like tells you to live your life or like dream big or do anything like that. I'm like so done with it. Like if I see, like I report them when I see them on Instagram reels. Like I'm like report button about like harmful content. Like I'm like just stop. Like कोई भी लगा रहा है.
Or just LinkedIn, right? Where you
I don't. My dream in life is to not have a LinkedIn profile. Currently, I have one. Like, my dream is in the next 2 years, I will be in a profession that does not need me to have LinkedIn.
Okay.
I'll be like, what's your LinkedIn? I don't have a LinkedIn. Jao dekho.
Yeah. But no, you're right. I think without having that pipeline, without systemically trying to solve for issues, without saying, hey, it's not just about selection, but it's also about where are we starting from, are all like starting from growing up to up until that position when someone is applying, is everything working, and you have tried to remove all those barriers. So I think that's an important point. I think talking about like this whole timeline bit, right? Like if you look at the history a little bit, like, you know, the Stonewall Uprising in 1969, right? I think if I'm getting it correct, was one of the pivotal moments, right, which led to like the first Pride, and like, you know, but it was a lot about resistance, right? It was a lot about like fighting for what has historically been denied, right? In India, for example, the ABVA, the AIDS Bharatiya Vikas Andolan, they released a report like Not Being a Gay, you know, which was one of the pivotal and like one of the first reports to come out, talking about, homosexuality in India, right? And like it had a huge impact on the Indian queer narrative, like how things are perceived. And they stood up against like the 377. They talked about how in the armed forces, for example, there should be like more recruitment and things like that. So when you look at the history of the queer movements, right, what are some moments that come to your mind which has kind of played a big role now looking back in hindsight, right? And what are some of the key things that we can learn from these
I think you speak of Stonewall, and I think Stonewall is of course an important moment in queer history globally, because I think it sets the stage for a assertion of queerness as a separate political identity that is willing to fight back. But go back a little further, even in India, and you'll see that in the 1940s, Babasaheb Ambedkar was standing up with the editor of Samaj Swasthya, which was a magazine published in Gujarati and English in Bombay, which had spoken about contraception and queerness. And it's a case that he loses in the courts in Bombay at the time, because the magazine is charged under sort of colonial era obscenity laws, which unlike the anti-sodomy laws still exist in our statute books. But you see a Dalit man standing up for the rights of queer people, right? In a tangential way, but even then.
Yeah.
A few years later, even before ABVA and before sort of the sort of manifesto for queerness that they produce comes out, you have the Dalit Panthers with Namdev Dhasal in Mumbai going to Kamatipura and marching with trans people and sex workers to Sharad Pawar's residence, because he was chief minister at the time, to demand justice from moneylenders who were charging them extortionate rates because they were not part of the formal economy. And so you see that queerness has always existed, and queer solidarities have always existed, and they have taken up issues that look very different to the ones taken up by those who take up queerness as a sort of ideological project, right? So financial inclusion becomes the rallying cry for queerness when a Dalit Panther leads that struggle. Inclusion in the army and removal of an anti-sodomy law becomes the demand when a group of primarily upper caste, upper class gay men put together a document. Right? So I think this is not a discount either.
Yeah.
Right? I think these are both struggles that continue. As somebody who's very happy that the anti-sodomy law 377 has been struck down, very happy for what ABVA did, for what NAS did. But at the same time, I think looking at the history of queerness across the world and in India, becomes very evident that who is fighting determines what is being fought for.
Yeah.
And to be conscious of that, not as a limiting factor. I think we live in a world where one is very easy to dismiss something from primarily because it's being brought over by a certain set of people. No, I mean, still a very valid struggle. I think it's one that deserves to be fought for, but to acknowledge that it's not the entire struggle is important. To understand that 377 is gone, but you still have a trans act with significant problems that the rest of the queer community has not stood up for is important to recognize and then counter. To create solidarities that allow for that sort of united fight is important. And to me, those solidarities are not created through calling people out, but by inviting them in, right? That you you have to now work towards creating structures where you feel a sense of community. You're not going to be able to fight for the rights of somebody who do not feel in community with, right? So that's what you're seeing across the board today. And this is not limited to queerness, right? I think you're seeing this with growing levels of polarization, growing levels of fragmentation in sort of communities, in identities, in countries and regions. You're seeing that there's little common cause left except for very sort of polarizing stances. And that's why you're seeing the narrative that you see, because people who don't agree with each other don't necessarily know each other or share. I mean, there's thing of sharing bread. They don't share bread with each other, right? So, and of course, we've come to a point where sharing bread is impossible with somebody who thinks your existence is invalid or wants to reduce your entire existence to nothingness. And there are circumstances and scenarios in which that sharing of bread or that coming to some sort of common ground is impossible. But I'm someone who still believes that you have to have faith that the possibility of a common ground exists. Because without that faith, there's simply, I don't see an end in sight to the sort of mess that we've gotten ourselves into. So I think if we see the history of the queer movement, it's one that usefully exemplifies how you need to sort of take into account that what you're fighting for might not be what everyone else is fighting for. And I think that's a lesson that we need to apply into the movement as it stands today. And I think the lesson that we need to learn is clear. How we learn that lesson still remains open-ended. And I think that's the job of the queer movement, of multiple other movements, of civil society groups, of activists, to figure out over the next few years that in this scenario, when we know that we need to build solidarities, how do we build those solidarities? And you see some of that. When you see NRC protests, you see Dalit Muslim solidarity being created. In some ways, the big story of this election is that Dalit Muslim solidarity, right? It's that Dalit Muslim solidarity crafted over the course of the CA that resulted in the swings that you see in UP, right? It's that solidarity, that the Marathi Muslim solidarity in some ways that you see the results in Maharashtra playing out the way they do. How do you create more wide-ranging solidarities? What does it mean to have a Dalit Muslim queer solidarity? What does it mean to have Dalit Muslim queer climate solidarity? Which you saw perhaps during the RA protests in Bombay, where you had environmental causes get linked to indigenous rights. What does it mean to sort of create groupings of common causes that can then serve as effective tools for building community? I was at Mumbai Pride right before the pandemic, and after that a bunch of us went to Mumbai Bagh, which was the sort of Shaheen Bagh equivalent in Bombay, and we were all in our Pride outfits, and I got wished Happy Pride multiple times over there. And for the sort of rabid Islamophobes who would have you think that all Muslims are sort of anti-LGBTQ plus, there was no better way of proving them wrong than by saying that this is what happened, right? That reality can be stranger than their fiction, and that these solidarities can be crafted and have been crafted in front of them. Right? So there are ways in which we're seeing the sort of possibilities of these solidarities being created today. How they get created, how they get sustained, because they're much harder to sustain than they are to create, remains to be seen.
No, 100%. And I think you also brought an important point around even within the community, right? I think when we look at all these intersectionalities, one, there is this huge stereotyping. Muslim citizens or Muslim folks are less likely to accept queer folks, right? Huge, wrong, I think, perception that has just built up over a period of time. But even within the queer community itself, we are also talking a lot about how, there is, people are fighting for different things. Like someone like an upper caste queer person, what they're fighting for versus what a Dalit queer is fighting for, maybe two very different things. But there is essentially, I think in those moments, it's also important for that upper caste queer individual, and of course the larger allies, but also the upper caste queer individual, maybe cross solidarities, or with Muslim individuals coming in, with other folks coming in together to support and stand up for what a Dalit queer is thinking about and what is for him.
But again, I think that it's yes, in principle. Absolutely. And a lot of the ways in which this has been explained is through a politics of solidarity, through intersectionality. What it produces, though, less effectively in India because we don't see it happening as much, but is a form of guilt, right? I think it introduces this notion that the upper caste person should fight for the Dalit queers' rights out of some sense of guilt, right? And I think one, guilt is not a sustainable motivational factor, right? You can only be guilty so long, and who knows that better than queer people? You're feeling guilty about your queerness until you come out of the closet. That's what forces you to come out of the closet. It's not a good feeling. I'm not going to, if you tell me, oh, support some like causes because you should, because you're privileged, you're like guilting me into it, I'll do it because you're guilting me into it, and that guilt will work. But one, not for long, and two, not honestly.
Yeah.
Right? So we have to find a better way of getting people to support other causes. And guilt cannot be it, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Right? Two, you have to have things go both ways. And I think in a sense, you've definitely seen it go both ways in India, because the people at the forefront of the 377 movement were trans women, particularly Hijra women, and a lot of lesbians, and a wide range of sort of caste oppressed queer folks, all of whom have been forgotten once 377 is gone. Right? So the massive public mobilizations that you saw against 377 were only made possible by marginalized queer people also taking to the streets, because there aren't enough queer privileged people to take to the streets. मतलब तो तुम सभी privileged queer लोगों को रास्ते पे लाते, तो how many people would you end up with on the street? There's no possibility of even getting numbers. So what I've often said also, that queer people are not a voting bloc because there's simply not enough of them. So there's not enough out queer people to make up a voting bloc. There's not enough out privileged queer people to fill up an auditorium, let alone a rally. So evidently, when you needed marginalized queer people, they were supporting you.
Yeah.
Now you're not standing up with them, like with the Trans Act. I'm more concerned as to how do you now get people to stand up for each other. And this is a question that unfortunately gets framed only as privilege versus unprivileged. It's a very bad framework to look at it. These are not solidarities that are difficult only when it comes from a difference in privilege. Dalit Muslim solidarities are difficult. They're operating along similar lines of marginalization. Right? And in some cases, one is more privileged than the other, etc., etc. But of course, now a sort of upper caste Muslim versus the Dalit solidarity is different. But even within sort of like caste oppressed Muslims and Dalits, there is difficulty in crafting solidarity. Right? Even within queer communities, where one might argue that privilege is almost similar, there's a difficulty in crafting solidarities. Right? Between we've seen this happen extraordinarily in the case of cis women and trans women being in solidarity with each other. This is a problem in the queer community as well, where a lot of lesbian women are not in solidarity with trans women. Right? And that's a serious problem. And you can't operate in the same sort of level of one is more privileged, one is less privileged. That's why there is no solidarity logic there as well. That's one way of looking at it. It can explain things fairly well in most circumstances, but I think it sort of misses the forest for the bushes.
And I think it's also like, if my feminism is excluding you, right? Like when we talk about it at times, is it really like feminism that way? Like, what you're talking about, if lesbian women are not standing with trans women, but sometimes it's just about solidarity, like you're saying, but sometimes...
But I'm saying, why is this happening, right? I think we need to figure out where have we failed to sort of create these solidarities. I think for me, it's incredibly important to create solidarities through joy. That this notion of sharing bread, this notion of coming together in happiness is more important than coming together always in protest. Right? I think that's why, to me, sort of like throwing parties is an integral part of my personality and my life, because I think that when I have people come together, it's people who come from very different sort of experiences, who come from very different backgrounds, who come from very different ideologies, and to create spaces where that joy can be felt together makes it far easier to then expect those people to stand up for each other. That it then becomes much easier to convince somebody to support someone else, because it comes from a feeling of, oh my god, like tomorrow if you got like into a fight and somebody like smashed your face, I would not come to the hospital because I felt guilty.
Yeah.
Right? Like I would come because, oh my God, Nikunj is hurt. Like what can I do to help?
Care.
Exactly.
I care, yeah.
So politics of care
is important.
Far more important and far more difficult to build. Like no 100%. Chance. Politics of guilt is much easier.
And also like there's just so many things, so many issues, so many like...
Exactly. You have to build a politics of care. We have to pick. No, you have to build a politics of care so that you can allow people to show up when it matters most effectively. When you create a politics of guilt, you open the doors for performative activism. Then you're guilted into doing something, तो चलो सभी Palestine की story लगा देंगे. All eyes on Rafah. Important. Important moment of solidarity. Politics of guilt is immediate. Politics of guilt is useful. When it results in an action where Netanyahu knows that he can't bomb Rafah because X million people have vocally supported sort of justice for those in Rafah, useful. Not sustainable. How many of those people are going to care about Palestine 1 week later? How many of those will care about Palestine 1 month later? How many of them will care about Palestine 6 months later when this is not on the news and maybe a ceasefire has been achieved but real structural change hasn't happened? You saw this in the Nakba, right? You saw this at other moments in history, and I think it's pivotal to understand that a politics of care that needs to be crafted through moments of joy is far more sustainable than a politics of guilt that gets crafted through sort of acts of performative activism that fizzles out very quickly. And I think for me, queerness has always sustained those communities of care and a politics of care through spaces of joy. Right? Kareem Khubchandani has written a fabulous book on queer nightlife, right? And how queer nightlife sustains queer communities. Why is partying important for queer people? Why does drag become so important? Like why does a Paris is Burning documentary that shows you New York ballroom culture become so pivotal and so important in sustaining a Stonewall and ensuring that one stone thrown at Stonewall doesn't become limited to just one stone thrown at Stonewall. Right? I think it's important that we go back to queerness as a source of understanding how these spaces of care were crafted, and they were flawed. They were sort of rife with violence, particularly sexual violence, with hierarchies that were damaging. They were sort of also in many ways drivers of a lot of sort of inter-community disputes, but undergirding that entire structure was care. Which got people to stand up for each other. That got people to sort of protest against the Nixon administration when it was purposely denying people with HIV access to care. Right? That was letting people die of AIDS. Right? That's when you saw people come out, not because they were guilted into it, but because you had communities of care that had been created around queerness that then sort of stood up for queer people when it mattered most.
I think that's like the big one to take away, like when we start talking about movements, right, and what we can learn from them. Like, how do we do it? It's not like you're saying, it's not an easy task to bring that, and how do we do it? And I'm also curious, like towards the end of the podcast, you also wrote like a note to your future self and like, what you've written about. But going back to Stonewall, which you were just referencing, right? And I was reading this article in Stonewall, Scotland, mentioning about 2/3 of LGBTQIA plus people who experience NG-LGBTQ violence or harassment, over half of sexual and gender minorities in Southern and Eastern Africa, like roughly 56% have experienced violence, right? And like the statistics kind of keep on rolling around, like, which is pretty sobering, in fact. And even if you come back closer to India, the Swasti Health Center did a research around, like, around half of the men who are facing queer physical violence because of their queerness, sexual abuse, and as well as because of emotional torture as well. Now, I think one of the big things is that the data itself in India about things like this is scarce. There isn't a lot of information that exists like this, and due to the lack of information at times we're not even aware of the full picture, right? So I'm curious about, like, in your work and generally, like, how does this lack of data kind of impact your work? You're also trying to collect information in your own ways as well, right? But how does it overall impact the, the struggle, the movement, and even the queer policies, queer affirmative policies?
Somebody who just got a lovely book, I can't remember his name, we've spoken before, but on queer data. And there's a spectacular range of examples, and he's in the UK and writes more from a sort of Western world perspective, but also has a lot of valuable insights into the sort of nature of this data, right? I think there's two things to keep in mind. One is I'm a data pessimist.
Oh, you're a data pessimist.
I'm a big data skeptic, data pessimist. I'm always concerned by the ways in which people assume कि data मिल जाएगा तो problem solve हो जाएगा.
That's true. Yeah.
Like, okay, we don't have the data, but we know now that there's violence. Like, it's not rocket science. Now, if I know that the violence is 50% versus 75%, my world is not changing. So these are often arguments, in my opinion, very humbly, that policymakers use to get more funding, to get more data, so that they can keep their own jobs. But in my opinion, waste all of that funding on doing stupid things like data collection that in the long run prove to be ineffective. This is not to say all data is bad, but imagining that all problems can be solved with data is ridiculous.
And sometimes, like, even the researchers looking at very niche spaces versus that funding can be better used, somewhere else.
No, that's fine. I don't know, funding should be used for whatever niche spaces, but I'm saying, yaar, dukaan kholo, yaar, like, let everybody get funding, whatever you get funding for. It's like, see, I'm a firm believer that if you can get funding, you should get it for whatever else. Why am I going to feel bad? Yeah, like, you're making some money, have it and enjoy it. But don't delude yourself into believing that data is going to fix things.
Of course.
Argue for the funding to get money to get the data, that's fine. All been there, done that. But don't pretend, at least to yourself, that data will solve things.
Of course.
So I think that's the biggest problem. Right? I think we can't be so reliant on data and so confident that data is our solution, because queerness again teaches you a lot there, right? That queer people have had data collected on them. I mean, Nazi Germany collected data of queer people and look where that was used, right? Queer people have been subjects of sort of data and of sort of medical experimentation for their queerness and have had their sort of identities be reduced to data through the sort of AIDS epidemic as well, right? And so in many ways, you have to be wary of data, which queerness teaches you. I mean, the fact that the world took COVID-19 far more seriously than HIV was because of data. Because it could be shown that, the numbers aren't high enough and they're only in a certain part of the population, so we don't care. Right? And so the numbers can often be used to inflict vast amounts of violence. Even with the COVID-19 pandemic, the fact that countries in many parts and in many parts of the world took a decision to lift restrictions early based on data, because they said, like, it'll only kill like 50,000 people, even if it like does, and then everyone will be fine. The fact that you could reduce the sort of suffering of 50,000 people to a data point to make an economic justification that, but it'll save us like $4 billion because we'll be able to open 1 month early before like vaccinations arrive or people get their second dose, is a way in which data can be violent. That being said, now collection of data is important in India. We don't know the number of trans people in this country, so we can't make an effective argument about how to grant affirmative action. We don't know the number of queer people also in this country, although that number is very difficult to find, because what exactly is a queer person and how do you define them? We don't know statistics around access to health and the funding allocation. So I think data collection is important when it is subversive, in that when it's collected with the aim of finding out what those in power are doing with resources. So how much money has been allocated to ART centers across the country after NACO, which is the National AIDS Control Organization, was handed the additional task of, if I'm not wrong, also tobacco prevention or like smoking prevention. Right? So when you burden an agency that's been given an important mandate of actually preventing HIV transmission, and preventing people dying from AIDS and treating people with AIDS or those living with HIV, with this stupid additional task of a smoking ban or controlling of smoking, what are the impacts it has on HIV prevention in the country? Right? What is the number of what is the dollar amount for the subsidy granted by the government for ART treatment? What are they doing for newer forms of HIV treatment that are now available abroad and need to be brought to India under the sort of no patent or patent amnesty scheme for HIV drugs, right? This is where data can help. But mindlessly collecting data now, there were a lot of surveys, and I say this very sweetly because I think I knew people doing them as well. How many queer people support the BJP? क्या करोगे डेटा के साथ? Most of them did support the BJP. Now,
and forget even about like the sampling and everything.
But that's what I'm saying. Now you've used that data to make a point.
It has like a very specific angle.
Correct. And listen, yeah, I work in politics. We know how to manipulate data. आपको survey चाहिए, exit poll देख लो.
The exit poll is...
I think after exit polls 2024, we should stop believing in data. I just have a like humble request to everybody, please. Like, your top pollsters across the country, we have these sample sizes. I loved it. It. 1st June, I was watching every single news channel, watching every single exit poll. I was like, wow, you know, amazing. Like, you've done like 5,000 respondents from like across the country, and you're publishing an entire exit poll based on that data. Great. Like 1.4 billion people in your sample size for one of these exit polls, 5,000. Like, that's not even like 10 people per constituency.
Yeah.
Like, it's 543 Lok Sabha seats, 5,000 is the exit poll number. क्या sampling? क्या assembly segment भी नहीं है उसमें तो मतलब some constituencies have 13 assembly segments. You didn't even get one person from each assembly segment. So I shall leave those collecting data to their data collection, but I don't particularly believe that. Data is the solution.
In and of itself, 100%.
And but also, now, okay, you could collect data about people facing violence. Data has to have a purpose.
Exactly.
Now, people facing violence in India, I collect the data. What's the point? Who's in power? Modi ji. You're going to show Modi ji a document saying so many people face violence, he's going to listen. Now, it can be useful at other moments. Like, data collection was very useful when I'd gone and met Ajith Pawar when he was Deputy Chief Minister. He constantly remains Deputy Chief Minister. So the man is quite a genius, because regardless of who is in power, he is Deputy Chief Minister. But I'd gone and met him.
Huge.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Like, truly, like, people say his future's over, etc. But what a guy. Like, the party foldly shift ho gaya, Deputy CM ban gaya. He's leading a good, charmed life for now. But I met him when he was still Deputy Chief Minister under the MVA government. And this was again right before the pandemic, and with a couple of trans activists, and then Supriya Sule, who was organizing that meeting. And within 5 minutes, the Transgender Welfare Board in Maharashtra was cleared. A budgetary allocation was given to it of 5 crores, which never ended up seeing light of day, given that the pandemic happened and then the government fell. And there was a promise made of an LGBT helpline. Because I raised the demand that we should have a helpline, because young queer kids were dying by suicide. Right? And pulled up a list of sort of numbers, being like, this is the number of sort of deaths that we've seen in this sort of time period. And this is disproportionate compared to what you would see in non-queer kids. That data point works. That's when data is useful. Randomly collecting data about violence, unless it's directed at being used by somebody or influencing somebody's thinking, it's pointless. I'm all for data as PR stunts. But one that should then have some sort of basis in fact, you can spin a tale and use data to spin a tale, but if you only want to use data to spin a stock market bump and a fall, then people are going to see through your data the next time.
Yeah.
So collecting of data is good, using of data is good to bolster an argument. Believing data as the solution is, in my opinion, thoda like.
And reducing someone to,
reducing someone to data is even worse.
Even worse, right? And that has historically always been the case.
But that's precisely the point, right? That data once created can be used by either side. Data is a point, and a point can be spun.
Yeah. No, but even in terms of research, like I think participatory research, for example, like you're just saying, oh, I'm someone coming from the outside.
Yeah.
I'm just going to do the survey on you.
Correct. Like
you don't know much.
I think
you never even go back and share ki
never.
You're just
so I'm like, pay people ना, चलो ना पैसे भर लो, फिर मैं आपका survey भर लूँगा, आप मुझे पैसे दे दो. I never fill out surveys. I hate them. Again, unless a friend is asking me. And so if I care for you, then I'll be part of your research because I know that you'll handle my data with care.
Yeah.
So I think there also care is important in data. If you're doing data collection, then do it with care.
Yeah.
Often community organizations that do a lot of grassroots work will have better data than large organizations that come with better funding and better sort of strategies.
Yeah.
Right? Because they're in touch with people.
Yeah.
People are more honest with them.
Yeah.
So if you look at data that way instead of just as like कुछ sample size इतना ये जो qualitative analysis होता है वो कोई करता नहीं. You only want quantitative.
Yeah.
You're not asking who was the person interviewing the person. You're not asking how long do they spend with each person.
Yeah.
You're not asking any of these questions.
Yeah, all the biases that kind of...
All these biases are then they're just a footnote in data, which is why I'm a data skeptic. I'm like, acha, you collected data and like biases hai.
Correct.
You're just assuming that there will always be biases, so we shouldn't do anything about them.
Yeah. I think you are also talking about violence, right? Like all of this inflicts violence. I actually want to pick up on that a little bit. And this can be a deeply personal subject. But, how have you or someone close to you, experienced violence, based on their identity? And I think you're also talking about like violence doesn't manifests and inflicts in one way. It's not just mental violence. It's not just physical violence. It like manifests itself in hundreds of ways. What are all these different ways it is manifesting itself?
I mean, of course, there's like structural violence, right? I think that's the one that I face more than I face any. Touch wood, I haven't faced physical violence. I haven't really had to have familial violence inflicted upon me either. I've been fortunate enough to have incredibly caring friends and family, particularly with regards to my sexuality, who've been very accepting and kind. I think the violence that exists is the one that sort of is structural in the denial of that's a self-denial, right? Which you deny yourself opportunities, you deny yourself the possibility of doing something because you think it's impossible. And that's a very deep sort of seated violence that has a damaging impact on you as you move forward. But I think the other kind of violence that's tricky to navigate is one that manifests as a function of power rather than of bias, right? So when I came back in 2018, there was a period when I was traveling across the state with the Maharashtra Congress president at the time, Ashok Chavan, who's also switched. I should stop working with politicians because everyone I work with switches parties. I'm the reason that everyone's switching parties. I only have to switch parties. Like this is I've realized. I'm like, क्या करूँ? हमारा कोई माँ बाप नहीं रहा कहीं पे तो हम कहाँ जाए? So, but I was with Ashok Chavan traveling across the state, and it was funny because I just come back from New York City. My biggest problem was I didn't have a wardrobe. And I was like, what do I wear? I'm like going to Ichhal Karanji and Pathardi and going and sitting on stage with like 3 former chief ministers and bloody like a bevy of former ministers, etc. And I have to like dress some way. And I was very clear that I can't wear that like white kurta, white pajama, rabbal chappal. Like I was like, nahi. Like, So then this outfit emerged. So it was sort of reacting to the limited possibilities of self-expression given the circumstances, and it worked well. I mean, there were a few snide comments here and there, but they were countered by the fact that I was close to Mr. Sawan, who was the head of the show, and so I had the ability of being like, I don't care about what you say because I have somebody else backing me. And even with Milind's campaigns, the fact that he's a dear friend and has become a dear friend over the years and treats me with a level of respect that ensures people know that they can't fuck with me is important and useful, but also an added element that I have to work towards ensuring that a cis hetero man in my position wouldn't, right? I have to ensure that somebody has my back all the time, that it's not, and maybe it's not, it's only, again, this is what allows you to build solidarity, because the Dalit woman is doing the same in her party. That like the sort of trans person is doing that in their own community. That you have to go that extra mile and play the system and play the game, because you have to like work twice as hard to get half as far, right? That you have to ensure okay, like I need to have one person like a Milind who's going to be very friendly with me, or an Ashok San who's going to be very friendly with me, so that nobody messes with me. So that I can just continue doing the work that I was hired to do. Like, this should not be something that I have to do.
Yeah.
Because you bloody hired me for this. Why must I also do all of this other work, like keeping someone else happy and ensuring I'm in somebody else's good books, just so I can keep doing the work I do? So I think that's the kind of violence, that's the everyday violence that's harder. Again, that's the kind of violence that data won't tell you about. It's the violence that can't be captured through data.
It needs a lot of listening. It needs a lot of trust,
somebody on Twitter said the other day, they were like, anthropology over data, something like that. Where it was true. There were people, and fewer of those than ever before, because there's no funding left to do that kind of work anymore. But there were people who were working in the field who predicted these elections better than the exit polls did.
Yeah.
Who were like, no, these numbers don't.
Itna wave bhi nahi hai.
So and that was useful. I mean, I believed all of these numbers. I to believe the exit poll data. I to went around telling everybody, 350, like 320 at the very worst, like BJP 270 to 290. It was because I was looking at data.
Yeah.
Where I was on the field doing anything this time.
Yeah. And something else that data doesn't capture, right? Even if you look at across the spectrum, and even if we talk about violence, it's an intersex person is more likely to, or is more vulnerable to violence than a gay man. But
then again, that's what I'm saying. Now, are you going to use data points to engage in oppression Olympics?
No.
Or are you going to... No, but the problem is this data can then be used that way, right? The data is open to manipulation. Once that fact is out there, it's going to be used in any direction, right? And unless there's a specific way in which you want to use data, its collection is a little pointless to me. And again, now I think I also realize that I am up against several forces when I say this, because when we went and did the MPP together, and we had a lot of work on empiricism and data and the importance of data. And
there was literally a course called evidence.
I know there was literally evidence in public policy was a course that I also took, and I took it because I was a data skeptic, and I came out a data skeptic. So I'm sorry, but they didn't really ensure that I was a converted acolyte. Yeah. So maybe I'll have to go back and redo that degree. But I to see data as a PR stunt. I'm like, if you can spin the data and that it's going to be spun well, collect it.
Yeah.
This data for data's sake that will allow insights to come out through it is is something that I haven't seen work out very well. And I'm happy to be proven wrong if it does.
Yeah. But even just beyond data, right? I think, of course, like, you know, do you think, like, of course, like, certain identities across gender spectrum, you know, are more vulnerable
100%
to violence.
100%. So you're right? So like, intersex people are more likely to face violence in the very early years of their life, right? Sort of genital mutilation being carried out without consent is a major concern. And there have been intersex activists who've been speaking up about this. And that's a sort of key area of concern. Trans women are most likely to face violence, right? Primarily because of the patriarchy, but also because of the fact that the only two professions that they can meaningfully engage in for a large part are begging and sex work, which are spaces in which you are far more vulnerable to violence because your access to protection by the state is limited and your recourse to state protection is inhibited by the fact that you're trans, right? Which is why Hassal becomes important, that you need somebody in a position of power to then support you, because otherwise a person in another position of power is not going to listen to you.
Yeah.
Which would have been very different than if a labor union had gone to Pawar side, right? Even though he's one of the most progressive politicians in the state and has been very queer friendly, and his daughter has been certainly the most queer friendly politician in the state so far. But despite that, if a labor union had gone and meet him, they would be listened to without needing a Namdev Hassal.
Yeah.
But because sex workers and trans women were going to meet him with possibly the same issue, right? The labor union could have gone with the same financial inclusion issue. That mill workers are getting ripped off by money lenders, and a politician would be more likely to listen. But trans women and sex workers who are also workers, going with the same issue, perhaps in the same number, would not be listened to unless they had somebody be that sort of interlocutor.
Yeah.
And I think that's the tricky part and the challenging part where the sort of violence manifests itself. And that's where the sort of discrimination faced by different members of the community also requires different forms of access to justice. So you can't compare the violence being faced by an intersex person to the violence being faced by trans women, or say that one is worse than the other or one is more oppressed than the other, because they're fundamentally different types of oppression and different types of violence, right? And I say this again as a gay man, right? So I think it's easier for me to say that, because then it also allows you to make a argument that violence faced by gay men is also equally valid. And sometimes that can be very problematic because it allows gay men to get away with a clean shit to say ki we're also oppressed, why are you blaming us for not standing up to others? But on the other hand, that's when you see it through a lens of guilt. But when you see it through a lens of care, you say that, oh, you're also going through this is also something that needs support. And there's obviously a lot of male fragility that comes in with this, and sort of men always want to be the victim and play the victim card everywhere, including gay men who are no different. But if we're going to dismiss concerns because the amount of violence you face is less than that faced by somebody else, that's not sustainable, and that's going to produce only resentment. Right? It's, again, I put this again through a lens of care, because I think it's important that if your friend was going through something trivial, you would still give them the same time and listen to their concerns as you would if they were going through something far more substantial, right? And which is why you like probably be there and go for a drink if they've gone through a breakup, but you'll also be there and go for a drink if they lose a parent, right? And so, are you going to, in a friendship, say that one is worse than the other, so I will like spend only 20 minutes if you like break up with somebody, but I'll spend 1 hour with you if you lose a parent?
Yeah.
Are you going to do that in a friendship? Or are you going to say, no, I'm going to be there for you no matter what? And I think those are the ways in which I think different kinds of oppression faced by different kinds of identities within the LGBTQ plus community, you have to address those issues in that manner. Because it's very important to sort of understand that these come from different sources and different sort of like pressure points, and then find innovative ways to tackle them effectively.
Yeah. And you were talking about just like addressing this, right? And surveillance is again like so tricky, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's can do more harm than good. So, and so how have you seen like state and societal kind of like this surveillance and monitoring? Like how has this panned out with respect to violence?
Again, Delhi has more CCTV cameras than Beijing.
Yeah.
So we live in the most surveilled country
Correct.
on planet Earth, right? Delhi is also the most unsafe city in this country, or one of the most unsafe cities in this country. So the logics of surveillance, which were to promote safety, to promote security, have clearly been demolished. So now the question arises, why do we have surveillance? Right? And I think you can assume malintent, and I do always with any government, regardless of who's in power. And you can expect the worst. But the reality perhaps today is that we don't really know what is going on. And in a strange way, we've got a surveillance state being set up, right? I'm a frequent Digi Yatra user, despite the lovely people.
So you have Digi Yatras.
I know, the bloody Internet Institute, there's the India Internet Foundation guys, and all those other lovely people who I know very well have been yelling at me for it. But listen, am I getting Digi Yatra and giving the government my data, or am I missing my flight? Like, I can't show up to the airport early. Like, this is...
Okay.
And as you know, like, I don't like flights and I miss them. So, I'm happy, like, with the government taking my data and me not missing flights. I'm happiest with the government making a train from Delhi to Mumbai that doesn't take 15 hours, and I will only take the train. Right? So my public policy imperative is I will submit myself to surveillance while advocating for trains. So then I'll become anti-surveillance once the trains arrive. So like I'm aware of the problems of surveillance, but I'm not convinced entirely of the argument of this surveillance data is being used in a very damaging way.
Yeah.
Because I haven't seen, and perhaps I haven't read enough, so maybe somebody should educate me better on this, but I haven't seen proof of the ways in which this has been used disastrously. And I think for a large part of the population, the surveillance is okay because it doesn't have terrible impact on their life, or they don't see it as a massive sort of danger. And you have to read George Orwell and Animal Farm to understand that it can become a danger. But we have, now in this country, the one thing that I have faith in with the government is that they don't do their job well. So, the surveillance state requires a very sort of effective government. And I think the country has shown this government once again, the people of this country have reposed their faith in ineffective governance.
Yeah.
Because they're saying कि don't become perfect.
Yeah.
तुम रहो 240 पर, करो coalition के साथ government form, because if you become perfect, you become dangerous. You can't have a imperfect authoritarianism. Now you can't have an incompetent authoritarianism. But our government is great at being incompetent. वो Digi Yatra चल भी नहीं रहा था that day at the airport in Bombay.
You have a lot of pain with Digi Yatra.
No, but I'm giving you the example because this is the funny thing. Like, I love Digi Yatra. No, I love Digi Yatra. It gets you through the airport really quickly. Delhi airport in particular, like you're like 5 minutes. Like I hate lines. And it's great because it gets me to the airport really quickly. But it's also great that it doesn't work all the time, because you can't be a surveillance state if you're not surveilling everything, na? Like, can you imagine you're a surveillance state to prevent me from going to Delhi, right? And you've gotten this facial recognition, etc. How will you prevent me if your bloody Digi Yatra is not working, your surveillance is not working on one random day? You can't be like, आज हमारा surveillance day चल रहा है भैया.
Yeah.
तो फिर obviously तभी तो मैं जाऊँगा दिल्ली. Then the best way to counter the surveillance state is what? Keep one banda at the airport who tells me कि चलो भैया आज Digi Yatra नहीं चल रहा, आ जाओ आप.
Yeah.
So there's ways in which incompetence is a great counter to surveillance. So if the government is not competent, this surveillance data can't be used very effectively.
Yeah.
It's also I have limited faith particularly now, and some restored hope, that people have the ability to prevent a government from going overboard. And I think you're going to see that now with even policy priorities. You're going to see, for example, the fact the CA will be in force, but the NRC will not happen.
Okay.
Right? You're going to see a moderation because the government will realize that people's movements will be able to shut down any policy move that is seen as draconian. And in a certain way, that's the only effective counter to surveillance. Now, the most effective counter is to stop surveillance, but then you need to build a larger public dialogue around why surveillance is bad. Because if you say surveillance is bad and you can't convince someone like me who is like very progressive, etc., then that argument is dhila. That being said, the people most against surveillance are the ones who you like think stereotypically are the least likely to be against surveillance. One of the biggest topics at the rallies in 2018, before Pulwama and before the 2019 elections, was Aadhaar. And how the government will now have data on where you take a dump. And this was in villages in Maharashtra where you could raise up the issue and be like, the government is gathering all of this data, they're listening to who you talk to on the phone, they're doing this, they're doing that. And one of the biggest factors in this election was people saying कि बिना डरे हुए बात नहीं कर सकते. People were scared of calling each other on the phone, which is when they realized that the government is doing a bad thing. The fear of that government, the fear that you were being listened to, the fear that what was being listened to could be used against you, was far more compelling. And the argument that that information could be misused was far more compelling than anything the government had actually done. Because if you see, I mean, except for some cases with this news laundry stuff and all, government hasn't particularly used surveillance data against ordinary citizens in a remarkably like widespread manner.
Okay.
So it's difficult to convince people that it's bad for you, that surveillance is bad for you. And they're like, हाँ CCTV camera लगाया तो है, मतलब it's increasing safety. It doesn't, but that argument is hard to sell if it's not doing anything bad. It's like, हाँ okay, chalo, it's not like increasing safety, but it's not doing anything bad either. Na?
It's like half the time it's not working with aap CCTV ki nigrani mein hai.
Correct.
It's just written only.
Correct.
But I think there's also like the societal surveillance at times, right? Not just like that, like, you know, your neighbors, you know, your people, and then there is that whole, you know, gaze over there where someone is overlooking as well. And I think Alan Page said, or someone like that, like, you know, the society would be a whole lot better if we just stop, you know, or like we just start being less horrible to each other in a very simple manner. But I just wanted to also talk to you about like the which you talked about, like, I think a little while back, about the legal rights, right? Like, I think this whole bouquet of legal rights, and I'm curious to know. Of course, I'll talk to you about the same-sex marriage, which was so much in the news a little bit. But what are some of the most important legal rights which queer folks are constantly being denied in this country, for example? And you know, now is the time you feel like it's 2024, we should have these rights. Why don't we have them anymore?
I think three things. Anti-discrimination, long overdue, doesn't exist. It's a right that you share in common with other marginalized communities, but protection against discrimination in housing, in employment, in access to government services is incredibly important. So a comprehensive anti-discrimination law is definitely incredibly important. I think the second thing is sort of horizontal reservations for transgender people. Grace Banu has been arguing for this a lot. I think we've got a stage in which you've gotten widespread agreement on the need for affirmative action for trans people. What you haven't seen is an effective policy engagement of affirmative action for trans people with affirmative action on lines of caste and what to do when those two intersect. So why should a Dalit trans person be only under Dalit or trans? They should have the option to be expressing their identity within the law as a Dalit trans person. And so the horizontal reservations aspect is very important, and I hope the government, after having trans people invited to the swearing-in ceremony, will take up the actual concerns of the trans community also seriously and effectively. And the third is a recognition of unions, right? And this could be marriage, this could be a civil union, this could be a partnership, this could be a live-in relationship, whatever you choose to call it. But you need a recognition of union, and I take a different stance than most others on this, and I don't see it as a need for a granting of rights, but I see it as a important step in ensuring access to protections, right? That when queer unions are recognized, it means that queer couples running away from home have the weight of the law, even when they're consenting adults, to say that they cannot be persecuted by their families, right? And today, unfortunately, the grim reality is that when queer couples do run away, and there are adults involved on both sides, the police still go after the couples because they have like parents who charged one or the other with kidnapping, right? And this is a setup that we have recognized over the years very effectively with interreligious and intercaste marriages. Today, every police officer knows that if they listen to the demands of the parents of one side of an intercaste couple and break up that couple, the courts will come down heavily on them. Even though there's been a limited understanding of that with queer couples, where the courts have said time and again that queer couples who are consenting adults have the right to cohabit and live together despite what their families think, time and again. It's not as easily legible and as widely understood as the concept of a marriage or a sort of relationship that's recognized by the law. And so you need that union to ensure access to protections. So that when people are running away from home, and there's a great intervention that was filed on natal family violence in the Supreme Court marriage equality verdict, which dealt exactly with this. Said that we don't want marriage because it's giving us like the right to buy a house together. We want marriage because it's giving us the right to not be hunted down by our families when we run away with each other. And so I think those three are the three top priorities in terms of any form of legal change in the next 10 years.
Yeah. And picking up the third one like a little bit more, right? Think when the same-sex marriage was being heard at the Supreme Court, I think it was Justin Narasimha, and I want to get it right, who said marriage equality for LGBTQIA never arose in this court and thus no precedent. Right of LGBTQIA is gender identity, right to sexual orientation, right to cohabit, and they have full freedom in the same. No unqualified right to marriage, and it is not a fundamental right. So essentially the question is, A, not a fundamental right. So how did you look upon the judgment, and what do you think about that?
You know, again, the court in all of its wisdom has held that the right to marriage is not a fundamental right. Now, there are differing opinions on this. There are lawyers far smarter than I am who've opined effectively on the matter and said that the right to marriage not being a fundamental right puts protections for intercaste and interreligious couples under threat as well. That being said, the court's observation that marriage is not a fundamental right, but that other fundamental rights are available to queer couples, is a building block for showcasing to the court its own inability to understand the petitions put before it. I think the court has fundamentally misunderstood the demands being made upon it, and the judges in all of their wisdom have not understood what was being asked for. If you say that all other fundamental rights are being granted to queer couples, if the title of marriage is the only thing that is preventing queer couples from accessing some of those other fundamental rights, then your denial of marriage or a substitute thereof by claiming that there is no fundamental right to union is a direct denial of fundamental rights to queer couples. And so the court can't say, oh yes, like everyone has the right to drink a glass of water, but not everybody has the right to a glass. So only those with a glass can be able to drink water. Right? So you can't, then you're not like, but we are not giving everybody a glass. Right? And we're not even giving somebody the ability to put their mouth to the tap to drink directly from it. You can only drink water if you have a glass. So now today I have the right to drink water, but I need a glass to drink water. And the court has said, but you don't have a right to a glass. So the court is guilty of engaging in complex legal gymnastics to make a very valid legal argument.
Of course.
I think the judgment is legally watertight. But it comes through with legal gymnastics that mean it is not. And I don't want to say this, which is why I said I hope that the judges have misinterpreted what the demands before them were, because otherwise the only viable explanation is that they have had a lack of good intent. And I think that is something that they will have to live with on their own conscience, because this is either a misunderstanding of the demands placed before the court or a lack of good intent. The lack of good intent is something that they and their conscience should live with. But I think you've gotten a situation wherein the possibility, unless review petitions before the court do better than one has expected them to do, you've gotten the possibility of a long fight ahead for any recognition of union, because it will now have to come through the legislature rather than through the courts. And how that unfolds, where that unfolds, does that potentially unfold through a UCC, will be left for us to find out, possibly in the next few months.
And talking about legislature, I mean, we have been talking about the new government getting sworn in. Let's assume Anish was one of the member of parliaments who was elected, in the latest election.
Aapke muh mein ghee shakkar. Very nice.
We need it. But what?
No, I'm very anti-representation.
You're anti-representation.
What Anish is going to do in parliament? Sit there and clap or what?
No, I'm not talking about representation. I'm just talking about Anish.
Achha, just Anish. Okay, Anish. That I support. That representation I support. I'm very clear.
Like in terms of representation, maybe there are like smarter queer folk.
100%. 100%. But I'm saying nobody. We'll go to that. But tell me, if Anish was elected to parliament,
as a member of parliament, right? Like which bill would you like advocate or push for the most?
No, see, again, I told you, I don't believe in lost causes. So if Anish is elected to parliament, he is, at least for now, being elected through the opposition. So I'm not presenting some private member's bill. Are you mad?
Even if you have to pick one, that's something you're passionate about.
Why? I'm not. See, again, whatever I'm passionate about, I want to see happen in practice. Like, as much as I love Dr. Tharoor and all of his valiant efforts, what private member's bill he got in for 377? Like, he failed. It was not even discussed. So if I want to make a point, I will bring about a private member's bill. If I actually want to make something happen, I will become friends with the minister of this government who will be able to make it happen. And I think currently the latter is a more viable option. I think if I was a member of parliament, I would spend my time and efforts becoming very good friends with the TDP and the JDU. And with Chandrababu Naidu and Nitish Kumar. And ensuring that they advocated for changes within committee meetings, within sort of other forums, to ensure that you have a more sort of queer-friendly approach to any forms of upcoming legislation. So I think the key ones would be, I mean, this is controversial, right? Because I think this is going to become a debate that we have to have at some point or the other, the UCC, right? I think if the government is bringing in a UCC, the Uttarakhand UCC is before us, so we know what their UCC will look like. We know that the opposition to the Uttarakhand UCC has taken a certain form, and so the amendments will be made accordingly. But what it might leave us with is a framework in which the UCC is gendered for marriage, but gender neutral for live-in relationships. The next 5 years, it might, or the next few months, it might be very possible to get the government to consider keeping the marriage provisions as they are, change the name of live-in relationship to civil union, because they've recognized live-in relationship as a separate entity anyway, or still call it a live-in relationship or call it something else, because it's been granted that status by the courts as well. Make the mandatory provision of registration of live-in relationships optional, and make those live-in relationships gender neutral. You'll have civil unions in this country, whatever work. What else do you need in a civil union, yeah? When the UK got civil unions at that time, they had fewer protections than this for civil unions, for queer couples. You will have a robust recognition of relationships that is gender neutral, that is brought in by a right-wing government, for which there is not, for which you don't have to change the world. You have to gently nudge and be like, who will notice? Right wing will be happy. शादी को टच नहीं किया, ये गे लोगों को शादी नहीं दी. Left wing will be happy, कुछ तो मिला. Janta will be confused कि what is okay, they're being recognized, live-in relationship is being recognized, चलेगा. You'll get your desired outcome, which is that when a young lesbian couple from Punjab runs away, their families don't get to bring them back and like then tear them apart and keep them in isolation until one of them is married off. You know, so thinking pragmatically and practically is more important when you're in politics than having to contend with the ramifications of actions is also important.
True.
What does it mean to get these rights through a UCC, which has actively been projected as an anti-Muslim law? Right? What does it mean to support a legislation that has had such large Islamophobic rhetoric around it? And I'm keeping the legislation itself aside, the idea of a uniform code aside, all of those things aside. But in the national consciousness, it's like Musalmano ke chehre pe thappad. That's the projection, right? Are you going to support that same provision? And then what does that do to your Dalit queer Muslim solidarity? What does that do to your idea of intersectionality? And you have to make that choice, and you have to make that hard choice. And I don't know what side things will fall. I don't know what side I will fall, quite honestly. And what the possibilities will be for negotiating these contested terrains, right? I think these are the sort of challenges that one will face even more so now than before, where you will have to work with / cooperate with the government and have to deal with the fact that sometimes they can take very progressive decisions. For what it's worth, the government brought about the Trans Act, most progressive piece of legislation on trans rights in the history of this country. Very flawed, 100%, but it's more than anybody else has done. So फिर क्या करे? With what face does the opposition look to the trans community and tell them, don't support Modi, he's bad for you, when he's doing more for them? And the opposition has done. The opposition is in power in 5 states of this country. What have they done for trans rights in those states? What have they done for LGBT rights in those states? How are you arguing that the queer community should support the opposition or be anti-Modi when you're not doing anything? So these are the solidarity again goes to
Of course.
So these are questions that will be very tricky to answer.
100%. Okay. Something you were just talking about, right? I think the narration and like how something is represented out there in the media, and we have seen like what often gets peddled in the popular media on the news channels, etc. But even beyond just that, right? We look at the larger media, the social media, the books, the movies, the podcasts. There's like a lot of stuff to on how we consume content. In a lot of ways we do that. You yourself write a lot, like so many places. I mean, it's endless. You speak a lot and are vocal about things. You're a JLF regular as well. And how have you seen, like how queer folks are increasingly being, represented or talked about in the popular media vis-a-vis how it was before?
I just saw, because it's Pride Month and everyone only asks you these questions once a month.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a lot more representation in June. But the other times it's like it was 10 years ago. I kid. I think there's been significant strides. I think, to me, representation is a tricky terrain, right? That there's always going to be gaps in representation, because queerness and the queer community comes with a huge range of diversity of identities, of experiences, of life stories, and to expect that one person or a few people or one story or a few stories or a few narrations of that experience can represent the entire community is to embark upon an unrealistic endeavor to begin with. Right? So I think the question when you deal with queerness and when you confront queerness is, how do you represent that kind of diversity, and is representation the best way to ensure that the diversity of those experiences is narrated effectively? Right? So it sort of ruptures it significantly. And queerness is very strange as a form of minoritization in India. Right? Other forms of minoritization are, because by design, except for maybe religious minoritization in some ways, but gathered along the lines of caste, which means that there is a structural way in which uniformity is enforced upon sort of caste identities, right? That's why we have affirmative action with the historically marginalized communities. It's a question that's come up significantly for LGBTQ plus rights as well. Can you have affirmative action for queer people? My opinion, no. You can have it for trans people who've caught in a historic form of marginalization, but for queer people, you have not been sort of systematically denied opportunities by virtue of your birth, right? So queer people can be born into a really rich house also. They can be born into a really poor house also. They can be Brahmin also, they can be Dalit also, they can be Adivasi also, they can be Hindu also, they can be Muslim also. They can be an aristocratic family also, they can be a sort of like political family also, they can be all of these things, right? So it's a very strange community in the country where there's a wide range of like economic, cultural, social and political capital available within the community. How do you represent that effectively? In some parts, that representation then reflects the idea of queerness that those who have the power to engage in that representation want to reflect. So you'll see it in Bollywood with the Ek Ladki Ko Kaha To Aisa Laga, which I loved because I love Sonam Kapoor and because I love a good old Bollywood drama. But it's got an idea of queerness that's very appealing to me, because the idea of queerness that I would probably live out, right? Find somebody from my same socioeconomic status, have a nice big wedding and then live happily ever after. It's not the reality of queerness for a lot of other people. But you also can't say it's not the reality of queerness for a lot of queer people as well. It is reflecting what a lot of queer people feel like. But maybe not what the majority feel like, but it's not a small, insignificant minority. Right? So, the only solution is that you have to let people be able to express their own story. How do you reduce the barriers to access that somebody needs to tell their own story? Instagram is a great one. Anybody can tell their story now. How do we ensure that those with lesser access to like understandings of how algorithms work have the same ability to tell their story? So I think, for example, YouTube courses on how to become an influencer do more for representation than social justice sort of causes do, right? Because to tell your own story, I don't want to tell a person कि मैं तुम्हें charity कर रहा हूँ इसलिए मैं तुम्हें एक newspaper article दे रहा हूँ. I'd much rather teach a person how can you become the next like Instagram influencer and be bigger and better than all of these others who are like pretending to be the shit right now. And then that person should be somebody who is not coming from privilege. Because what does it take? You need a phone. Now, Masoom Minawala is also making a video with the same device that somebody sitting in Udaipur can. Right? Using the same platform. So you've got a sort of platform democratization where everybody can be on the same platform in a way we never had before. Earlier, only Kareena Kapoor could go to the Filmfare Awards. Today, she's also on Instagram and has to like make reels. You know, actually she doesn't. She's not on Instagram. She's too cool to be on Instagram. But you know, these are the Bollywood people.
And you know that.
Yeah, I do know that. She came on Instagram recently. She has one post or a few posts, but she's not made a reel yet. But you know, like earlier you had to be like in a Bollywood movie to become famous. Yeah, today you have to be on Instagram. And everybody can be on Instagram. So it's not a perfect space, but how do you get that to be more effectively represented? Places like Substack. Write your own comments. Twitter, social media. Can we create something that allows people to tell their narratives more easily? Can you create collectives that support like independent filmmaking or narrative telling? These are what will solve representation. I think we need to look at representation structurally, not as a data point. Like we got so many people or so many people have been involved, etc., etc. But now, like, I want to be able to enable queer people to achieve the same levels of excellence as straight people. I'm not interested in handouts. I'm not interested in like A for effort. That's also why when you ask me what bill I'm going to pass in Parliament, I'm going to get something done. I'm not going to do something because it looks nice to do it. And that pursuit of excellence is what is lacking when we have conversations around representation today. Is this idea that representation is charity. And until you break that myth, representation can never be effective. And so I think you have to look at it structurally. And then you have to be able to sort of counter the arguments that are being made currently.
I think being able to tell your own story is like so powerful and inspiring. I think Alice Dunbar is a great example as a biracial, bisexual woman in like 1870s being able to do that, which inspired like a lot of other people to do that. You rightly pointed out it's Pride Month.
Yes.
Happy Pride.
Happy Pride.
And with that comes like a little bit of, tokenism.
A little bit. I saw a rainbow outside Apna Bazaar the other day. I was like, is Apna Bazaar queer now? Like, then somebody was like, no, this was the Swachh Bharat logo. But I was like, wow, God bless Modi ji. Modi ji is like promoting queer rights across the country. It's very funny. The Swachh Bharat logo is a rainbow. And so if you go across the length and breadth of this country, that, actually. Every public toilet now, or every sort of like Sulabh Sauchalaya complex, there's a lot of them now. They don't have water, that's a different story. But the complexes have rainbows painted on them. So you go across, and this was back in 2019 also, across bloody rural Maharashtra. I was like, there are rainbows everywhere. Like, what is going on here? Are we in like some queer utopia in Ichalkaranji? Like, the tokenism is all around. Somebody shared a photo where an entire ATM was filled with pride flags, and I said, "वो पैसे भी free मिल रहे हैं या मतलब सिर्फ pride flag वहाँ पे लगाए हुए हैं?" So I was like, great, like if you spend that money giving me money, I'd be happy.
Yeah, no, 100%. It's crazy amount of tokenism, right? And it's like, I think the popular term for that is rainbow capitalism, right? Like this month you're just like leveraging it left, right, and center without making concrete effort. And even when there's an effort, like I think there was this Titan ad I once saw where it showed, I think it was one of the first ones in India showing like a couple, like a lesbian couple.
Yeah, I remember this ad.
Right, but even that ended up being stereotypical in its own ways, you know.
But again, now like I'm saying, this is my problem. It is stereotypical, but it is also what a lot of people want.
Yeah, and so then what you're saying is right? Like then the argument, or like whoever is just trying to do it, they're just trying to not tell an authentic story.
No, they are telling an authentic story, but it's not everyone's authentic story.
That's true as well.
So now that's the problem. Like, I'm fairly sure that queer people were consulted on that. And what if there is a queer lesbian couple that wants that?
Okay.
And there could be a lot of queer lesbian couples who want that. Now, are you going to say their experience is not as valid as that of somebody else? Then you're like, nahi, mujhe charity karni hai, so I must display this experience that's the most unusual, or the, you know, then don't do it out of a sense of like tokenism in that front also. Don't be edgy, don't be non-stereotypical to be tokenist.
Just to be like go viral or things like that, right?
Like then, like, no.
Yeah.
Like, it was a great ad, like it was like so sweet. Like, that's why I loved एक लड़की को देखा तो ऐसा लगा as well. It was so dumb. Like you knew the end of the movie before you started it, but I knew the end of Jab We Met before I started it. I still love Jab We Met. I watched it like 500 times.
Oh really?
Yeah, it's just my like constant. Like I've definitely watched it like at least 20 times a year. But you know, this is the problem.
Yeah.
What do you do in such a scenario? You wait for things to even out.
Yeah.
5 years ago, you had a lot more tokenism for Pride Month than you do today. You know, because companies are also realizing that consumers are bored. And they also realize that your logo changing on the 1st of June and changing back on the 1st of July is not doing you any favors.
Yeah.
So companies they learn slower than we expect, but that's because corporations are not as smart as our lovely economists give them credit for. So.
Yeah, and so like thinking about all this tokenism, right? And you're right. I think as long as, I think on the same mat, if queer individuals have been considered on, and like they're the ones who are like leading that, can be anybody's story. But coming back to that rainbow capitalism, right? Like how do you think then the brands, you just made an argument they're not as smart, like how do the brands then move towards like fostering genuine acceptance, like changing policies that are needed?
Now who's asked, like you ask this to companies. Now I deal with politics. So if I start dealing with brands also, then I'll lose.
So what would you advise them though?
What should I advise them? Who's listening to me when I'm talking about brands? They should put their money behind like more effective things, no? Like get Grace Banu flight tickets to come to Delhi when she's arguing for horizontal reservations. Like maybe make her carry your like company backpack when you do that. You know, spend money doing that. Spend money on getting like conversations organized at like local sort of spaces. Get free parties. Like that's what I'm saying. Queer spaces existed on Joy. Like throw a party and don't charge a ridiculous entry fee, or make it a no entry fee, and make that a queer community space where everybody can party regardless of whether they can afford a 500 rupee drink or not. Like use your marketing money to throw like a massive rager, and people like you a lot more. Absolute does this really well, honestly. They just need to make their parties a little bigger and their guest list a little wider, but they throw a banger of a party. They're like, this is all the branding we need to do, because if you're doing it for the queer people, and all the queer people will come for that party because there are only so many queer people. So throw a party.
Yeah, and talking about that, I think Pride, like obviously it just still centered a lot around, you know, resistance, right? But it's also like a celebration, right? And also at times it brings to the forefront.
And it is both of those things simultaneously.
And they can coexist.
Yeah, not only coexist, they are integral to each other.
Correct.
Which I think is the importance of queerness when it comes to understanding resistance, because I think it articulates the importance of celebration while resisting more effectively than anything else, because that's the only way to create a sustainable moment.
And why is that celebration of queerness so important? Because often, many times, I've met people and they're, why are we celebrating this? Like,
I'll give you the standard line now, which is that straight people celebrate their heterosexuality through marriages all the time.
Correct.
The queer people only get one day of a pride parade to celebrate it. But no, I think, those people I don't pay attention to. My favorite moment was at Mumbai Pride a few years ago when everyone was walking down the streets, and Mumbai Pride happens in a very busy part of the city, unlike Delhi Pride, which happens in like central Delhi with like nobody around. In those very
it goes from like one point to Jantar Mantar at the end of the day, where most of the protests are happening.
To Jantar Mantar, and it's a very lovely pride. It's great. It's everyone comes together, but there's not that much audience.
Okay.
Mumbai Pride, there's like 5,000 to 10,000 people marching. There's like 50,000 people in audience, because like there's like buildings all around you, and like people are looking from their like houses to see ye kya chal raha hai. People on the side of the street are going. It's like the city is buzzing around you. Like it's not an empty day. And then somebody was joining in, and he was like, "Hikutli Jatra chalu hai." And Jatra is a sort of religious festival, usually a religious celebration. So matlab wo like a fair. And people were like, हाँ यार, मतलब वो एक दिन किसी और का होता है, दूसरे दिन किसी और का होता है, एक बाबा का जतरा निकल गया, दूसरे बाबा का निकल गया, इनका भी कोई अलग झंडा दिख रहा है. This must be some new religious version. They were also like, अच्छा, which religion are you now? And they didn't care.
Maybe
like,
it will help us.
Yeah, maybe it will help us. No, like people of this country are very happy. Who has a problem with anyone celebrating anything? You celebrate bloody everything. Like Karwa Chauth, you're celebrating this, you're celebrating that, you're celebrating everything that we're celebrating over here. From like July to February, you have like one festival after the other. India loves celebration. So I don't think the few people who make those arguments have watched too much like contrarian US television and need to like recenter themselves in this country. We're happy celebrating. Jao, kuch bhi celebrate. As long as you're not harming somebody, why mind somebody celebrating?
No, I think that's very true. And I think coming up towards like the end of our conversation as well, I'm curious, what would you tell someone who's listening to the podcast right now who is not queer, and on how can they be an effective ally to the queer community?
I think it's about, again, care, right? Don't lose care when somebody comes out to you. Be there for somebody when they do come out to you, and continue to maintain a relationship of care with somebody who might need it. And I think that's the best way to be an ally. I don't think like grand gestures and me don't go hand in hand. I don't care much for them. I don't think much of them. I think it's what can you do for those who you already care about, and how can you let them guide what should make you a better ally. Then if you care about somebody and they've been thrown out of their house, then obviously support them. If you care about somebody and they've shared a story about their friend being thrown out of their house, then do something about that friend, as a friend of a friend, rather than because I'm doing my like 2 bits of community service for the community.
Yeah. And what you said, not from a sense of guilt.
Not from a sense of guilt, but from a sense of care.
Yeah.
And I think that's very important.
And you write so much, you consume a lot of media. So I'm curious to know if you can share, like, at the moment, like, what are 3 things to read, 2 things to watch or listen, and 1 person to follow. What would you say?
Okay, so the first 3 things to read, I'll keep them like in order of length. So the first is, because nobody reads anymore. The first is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. Spectacular book about love, about loss, about longing, which is set in Paris. And Baldwin, of course, is a gay black man himself. But this novel is so much more. Definitely, like, it makes me cry every time. The second is Ocean Vuong's An Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. I love Ocean. I love his work. This is a novel, but it reads like poetry, and I think it would have done better as a poem, but it's still a novel, and it's beautiful, and I do really think it's quite lovely to read. And the third is actually Amitav Ghosh's eulogy, or sort of, what is it called when somebody dies and you write about? Obituary. Amitav Ghosh's obituary and tribute to Agha Shahid Ali. It's a Kashmiri poet that was published at donkeys years ago. It's available. And it's called At the Ghat of the Only World, or the last Ghat of the Only World, the Ghat and world are in there. And he writes about his friendship with Shahid and about how Shahid had asked him to write this piece. And I think it's not queer, but it's just such a beautiful moment of what it means to embody that care, right? And I think it's one of the most powerful things I've ever read, and I think it brings about that idea of care really beautifully. Two things to listen to. I don't listen to podcasts. I'm a terrible guest to have on a podcast because I don't own earphones. And I don't listen to music. And so...
Like watch maybe.
To watch. I love Queer as Folk, which is like the US one, not the British one. People will hate me for this as well, but everyone likes the British one, but I really like the American one because it's more trashy. It's like 1980s queer soap opera. Don't watch it with the politics of today. There'll be moments at which are scandalized and you'll be like, hey, show cancel. And it should be cancelled also in some parts, but it's like a crazy look into what the world was a while ago. And the second thing that I've really enjoyed watching, which I really want to model my life on, is Scandal. Which have you watched Scandal? With Olivia Pope in it.
Oh,
what's her name? Like the character's name is Olivia Pope, but she's a badass black woman actor. She like does all of she's like a crisis specialist.
Okay.
She's a lawyer and she like deals with all of these crises and like managing things behind the scenes, which I love. And the final thing is one person to follow. One person to follow. Oh, one person to follow right now is Priyanka Paul, amazing Dalit queer artist and activist who's been getting a lot of hate, unfortunately, for the work that she puts out, which is incredibly provocative, but incredibly necessary. And so if you have to follow one person, please go follow Priyanka because she's being trolled and we need to prevent people from being silenced because they're being trolled.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you for those beautiful
thank you. This was like super fun.
It was a beautiful conversation and insightful. Before we kind of wrap up, you wrote a postcard to your future self.
I did write a message to my future self.
Can you read it out? What did you write?
After this whole conversation, I think it's become more relevant than ever. It's written in 2024, we're witnessing an unprecedented collapse of any semblance of stability. This extends across fields, politically, socially, economically, geopolitically. Making decisions in such an environment is not easy because the bets you take are no longer based on facts or precedent. In such times, solidarities will be tested, friendships will be called into question, and decisions with wide-ranging ramifications will have to be taken. Dear Anish, may you hold the courage to do what is right, even when the alternative may be more rewarding and easier to pursue.
Oh, those are beautiful.
So this is my postcard to myself, given that I think everything that we've spoken about today and how it ties into this, I think it's going to be a tricky time ahead because all of us are going to have to make decisions. And I think it's going to be easier to do something that reaps no rewards than it is, or rather, easier to do something that reaps rewards while not being right than to do something right that reaps no rewards. And I think there's a way in which you'll have to activate an inner moral compass that can't be fueled by guilt. It has to be fueled by care. That's my postcard to myself and incredibly deep insight on life and everything else at this end
Your
of this
insights are
podcast. I
always
feel like
deep.
baapre.
No, but you have been incredibly kind and also generous with your insights, your time, your thoughts.
Nonsense.
Really, really appreciate it.
No, I really had fun.
I'm glad to hear that. Yeah. And we'll continue the conversation offline.
Yes.
But thank you everyone who joined us and is watching the video. At some point, I would like to conclude the conversation and take a moment for all of us to kind of take in the words of Lee Mokobe, right? So in one of their poems, like some of the lines read like, I swallowed their insults along with their slurs. The kids at my school opened it up without my permission. Called me by a name I did not recognize, said lesbian. But I was more boy than a girl, more boy than Barbie, more Ken than Barbie. It had nothing to do with hating my body. I just love it enough to let it go. I treat it like a house. And when your house is falling apart, you do not evacuate. You make it comfortable enough to house all your insides. You make it pretty enough to invite guests over. And you make the floorboard strong enough to stand on. Thank you.
Thanks,
you so
Nikunj.
much.
Lovely to have this. Please go like, follow, share, subscribe. He won't tell you this, but you should do this. Postcards is the new podcast series. Share it with everybody.